Welcome to part 4 and the final part of this stylized Toon shader tea scene in Blender. So in this part we'll be finishing up the entire scene, so we'll be adding the steam which is going to be coming up from the tea. We're also going to be adding the little bubbles and placing them on the tea liquid. We'll also be adding that cool Toon style outline, and we'll be also adding a window object which will add a shadow to make it look like there's morning sunlight shining through the window. And we'll do a few other things like adding a depth of field and doing some compositing. So let's start by creating the bubbles, and then we'll be putting the bubbles on the top of the tea. So I'm going to go back to solid view and I'll go to the add menu. I'm going to go to mesh and I'm just going to add an icosphere, and I'll bring the icosphere up and I'm going to scale it way down, and I'll just stick it right in here in the tea just so I can see how big it is, and I want to make it about that big, and I'll use the object context menu and shade it smooth. Then I'll press Ctrl 1, and Ctrl 1 is going to add a subdivision surface with 1 level. And I'll press Ctrl A and apply the scale, so this is now the new default size of the object. So let's now create the material for the bubble. So I'll go over here to the shading workspace and I'm going to zoom into the bubble, and then we're going to be adding in that same stylized shading technique that we created in the previous part. So let's click on the drop down here, and I'm going to start by adding in the wood table, but then what I'm going to do is click on this button here to duplicate the material so it is separate, and I'm going to rename it to bubble. And now let's select the wood texture here. We don't need this, so I'll hit X to delete it. And then right up here on the shadow mask, if I Control Shift and select it to preview it, I want to change a few of the settings. This roughness here, I want to turn all the way down to 0 so it is very shiny, so it looks more like a bubble. So now let's create the stylized bubble material right here. So I'll go to the add menu and I'm going to search for a principled shader. Let's drop the principled shader here, and I can go to the add menu and also add the shader to RGB. We'll drop this here, and let's put the BSDF into the shader of the shader to RGB, and I'll Control Shift and select it to preview it. And here on the roughness, I'm going to turn this all the way to 0 so that it is very shiny and it looks like a bubble. And then let's also go to the add menu, and I'm going to search for a color ramp. We'll put the color ramp right here after the shader to RGB, and we can make the different colors for the bubble. So on the linear here, I'm going to change this to the constant instead so that it has that stylized shading, and then I can drag these tabs out, and I can also hold down the control key and click here to make another tab. And then let's make the different colors for the bubble. So it's going to be kind of like tea colors. So I'm going to click here on the black tab, and I'm going to make this kind of like a light brown color. And then this black color here, this one is going to be kind of like a light peachy kind of tannish color. And then the last color here, this one is going to be fully white. So if you want to use the same exact hex values, the fully white one will be a hex value of 6Fs. And then this light peachy color right here, this one is going to be a hex value of FF, BC, A5, and then this last one right over here, this one is going to be a hex value of C8, 8E, 7A. So it's starting to look kind of like a stylized bubble. And I think I want to drag both of these values over just a little bit farther so you can see less of the white and more of that peachy color. So now we'll do the same thing with the shadow effect. So we're going to plug the color into color B and also the color into the color here, the hue saturation value, and let's Control Shift and select the mix to preview it. So now when this is in shadow, it's going to be darker, and then when it's out of the shadow, it'll be lighter. Now because this is a bubble, I want it to be slightly transparent. So I'll drag the material output back here, and I'm going to go to the add menu, and I'm going to search for a mix shader. Let's drop the mix shader here, and then we want to mix this with a transparent. So I'll go to the add menu, and I can search for the transparent shader. Let's put this on top here, and the transparent can go to the top one, and then this stylized shader can go into the bottom one. So now if we drag the factor around, it's going to be only transparent or only the mix. Now if it's only transparent, if you turn the factor to 0, it's fully black, and that's because we need to change some settings in Blender Eevee to make the transparency to work. So let's click down here on the material settings, and under settings here on the bubble material, we want to change the blend mode to the alpha blend. And now if I turn the factor up, you can see it actually is looking transparent. So I find that a value of 0.6 looks pretty good. So I'll turn the factor to 0.6. So now you can see it is pretty transparent, but you can still see that kind of stylized bubble shading. All right, so that is going to be it for the bubble for now. Now we are going to be adding kind of like a Toon style white outline to the bubble, but we'll be doing that later. So I now want to create that really cool Toon style kind of hand-drawn outline effect. And I'm first going to be adding it to the tea kettle. So the first thing that I want to do is create a new material, which is going to be the outline. So we'll select the tea kettle, and we're going to click on the plus here to add a new material. Let's click on new. So there's a new material in the material slot, and I'm going to rename it to outline. Now, instead of it being a principled shader, I'm going to delete the principled shader, and I'm going to instead search for an emission shader, and we'll put the emission into the surface. And then on the color here, I'm just going to make it fully black. So that's going to be the material for the stylized Toon hand-drawn outline. Now, there is one more important thing that I want to do on this outline material, and that is that under the settings here, I want to turn on the back face culling. And this is going to hide the back faces, so the back faces of the mesh, you won't be able to see that for all the faces which have that material. So now we're going to be adding that cool Toon style outline. So to do this, we're going to go to the modifiers. Let's click on add modifier, and I can search for a solidify modifier. So right now, if I just turn up the thickness, it's basically just making it more solid. So I can just bring that out. But to give it kind of that Toon style effect, we're going to open up the normals here, and we're going to click on flip. So this will flip the normals so that just the solidify modifier is going to have flip normals, so they're in the opposite direction. Now we need to go here to the materials, and on the material offset, right now it is turned to 0, and so 0 is going to use the very first material which is in the material slots. But if we go back here to the modifiers, we can change the material offset to 1, and that is instead going to use the second material. So again, right over here in the material slots, we have this outline here in the second material. So we're telling it that the solidify is going to be the second material. So now I can drag this thickness value, and you can see we're getting this really cool stylized outline. And I like a value of 0.015 on the thickness. I think 0.015 is pretty good. So now if you look around here, you can see it just has a really cool stylized outline. Now I want to add this same solidify modifier to add this effect to many of the other objects. However, I don't want to have to do it manually for each one and have to set up all the settings. So I'm going to copy the modifiers to the other objects so that I don't have to manually set it up for all the objects. Now, if I copy the modifiers, it's going to use all the modifiers, and it's going to get rid of any other modifiers on the object. So I need to select these other objects here. So we're going to select the tea saucer first, and this solidify here, this is actually making the mesh solid. So I want to click on the drop down and click on apply just to apply it. That way it just has the subsurf, and this teapot here also has the subsurf. So that way when we copy the modifiers from this object to the other object, it won't mess up how the object looks because they both have the subdivision surface of 2 levels. Also, I want to select the spoon, and the spoon has this solidify to make it thicker. So I'll click on the drop down arrow and click on apply. And then if I select this object here, the teacup, that just has a subsurf of 2. This one has a subsurf of 2, and this one as well. But then this object here, the napkin, I want to click on the drop down and apply the solidify, and select the last one here, the last napkin, click on the drop down and apply that. So I'm now going to hold down the shift key and select all the objects. So I'll select both napkins. I'm also going to select the spoon and the teacup and the tea saucer, so those objects. And then lastly, I'm going to shift select the teapot last. I'll press Control L, and I'm going to click on copy modifiers. So choose copy modifiers, and now if I click on all these objects, they also all have the solidify. However, you can see that it didn't really work, so these objects don't appear to have that Toon shader outline. And that is because we need to add that outline material to the objects. So I'll click on the teacup here. Let's go to the materials. I'll click on the plus here to add a new material in the slot. We'll click on the drop down, and I'm going to choose the outline material. And now it has the outline. So we'll do the same thing. Click on this one here, the saucer, click on the plus here, choose the outline. We'll do that for the spoon. So add a new material in the material slot, and we're going to choose the outline. And then this one here, click on the plus here, choose the outline, and also this one here, click on the plus, and choose the outline. So now they all have the outline, and that looks really cool. But then I do want to adjust some of the sizes because like for this one here, it's a little bit thick. So I want to adjust the size of the solidify. So I'm going to click here to go over to the modifiers. And for the teacup, I will turn the solidify thickness to just like a 0.01. So it's a bit smaller. I like that a bit better. And then for the saucer looks fine. So I'll leave that how it is. Now, as for the spoon, some of the spots you can't really see the outline. Like right here, you can't really see the outline. So for the spoon, I'm actually going to take the thickness value and I'm going to drag it into the negative values. So instead of it going in the mesh, it's going to go out of the mesh. And I'll just turn it to a very small number. I think like a 0.008 looks pretty good, just so that there's a thin outline. So that looks pretty good. And then for these objects here, I also want to make the thickness value a negative value because you can see in some spots here, you can't really see it. And you can see it right over there, but then it kind of disappears right here. So if I turn the thickness to a negative value, now you can see it on all of the edges. So that looks much better. So maybe just like a 0.01 for the cloth. Let's also select this one here. And again, I'll make it a very small number. So I'll do a thickness value of -0.01. So now you can actually see that outline along the cloth. Now I also want to add this Toon Style outline to the bubble, but for the bubble, I want it to be a white outline. So first what we're going to do is click on the bubble, and you can see the bubble just has a subdivision. So what I can do is select the bubble and then hold down the shift key and select the tea kettle last, and I'll press Ctrl L, and we're going to click on copy modifiers. So it now has the same modifier. However, instead of it being a subdivision of 2, I'm going to turn the subdivision down to just like a 1, because I don't really need to be that subdivided. And then this solidify here, we can change the thickness, and I'm actually going to make it a negative value so that it's coming out instead of going in. So just a small negative value. Now you can't actually see the outline. That's because we need to click here to go to the materials. We need to click on the plus here to add a new material. Let's click on the drop down and choose the outline, but then it looks really weird being a black outline, so I want to make it a white outline instead. So we're going to click on this button here to duplicate the material so that it is separate, and I can rename it. And I'm going to rename it instead to white outline, or you could call it bubble outline. So now that it's a separate material, on the color here, we can make it fully white. And now we have a cool white outline around the bubbles. And if you go back here to the modifiers, you can change the thickness value, so I might just make that a little bit thicker. So I'm going to jump back over here to the layout for now, and I'll go into the rendered view. So now that we've completely finished the bubble and the bubble's all finished, I want to use a geometry node setup to randomly place a bunch of bubbles all around the tea. So I'll drag this bubble right over here for now, and then I can click on the tea object, and we're going to click here to go to the geometry nodes workspace. And if you don't have a geometry nodes workspace, you can click and drag here to split the window, and you can click here to change the editor type, and you can change this to the geometry node editor. But I'm not going to do this, so I'm going to click here and drag over and let go to close that window. Let's click here to go to the geometry nodes, and I'll hold down the Z button and go into the rendered view. So on the T object, we'll click on new to add new geometry nodes. So we're going to be adding 2 main nodes, which are going to randomly distribute the bubble on the T. So I'll go to the add menu, and we're going to search for the distribute points on faces, drop this here, and then we're also going to search for the instance on points. So the instance on points node, we'll drop this here. So these nodes are going to be used to randomly distribute the bubbles, but you can see the T has disappeared. That's because we need to go to the add menu, and we need to search for the join geometry, and we'll drop this after the instance on points, and we need to take the original geometry, and we need to put that into the geometry of the join geometry. So now to actually put the bubbles on the T, we can go to the add menu, and we need to actually give it the object data. So we're going to search for the object info node, drop it here, and the geometry can go up to the instance of the instance on points. Now we haven't actually chosen an object to distribute, so if we click on the eyedropper here, we can choose the icosphere. And now there's going to randomly be those cool stylized bubbles all along the T, and you can turn up the density here to make more of them. Now, I don't want the bubbles to be overlapping too much, so on the random here, I'm going to change this to the Poisson disk instead. And this is going to give us a distance min value, so if we turn up the distance min value, there's going to be a minimum distance between all the bubbles. So I'm going to turn the distance min value to a 0.05, so there's just a small distance between the bubbles. There's still going to be a few bubbles which might overlap, so you could turn it up more if you want to, but I just like a value of 0.05. And then you can turn up the density max to make a lot more of them. Now instead of just randomly having lots of bubbles all around, I want to weight paint where I want the bubbles to be. So in order to weight paint, we actually need more geometry in the mesh. So I'm going to select the object, and we'll go into edit mode, and I'm going to go to the face select. And I'm now going to hit the I key to inset the faces, and then just place that there, and then hit the I key again to inset, place that there. And if it's kind of hard to see what's happening here on the geometry nodes, you can click on this little button here to hide the geometry nodes. So just hit the I key to inset, click there, hit I to inset, and just continue to do that many times. And we're just going to inset the mesh so it has much more geometry, because the weight painting needs geometry, and it actually weight paints on the vertices. So now we can click on this button here to see the geometry nodes again. And now we want to go to the weight paint. So we're going to click on edit mode, and we're going to change this to weight paint mode. Let's press Ctrl S to save the project again. So now I can just click and drag, and this is going to draw. And then also if I hold down the Control key and click and drag, that's going to get rid of the paint. So I'm just going to start to paint along here. And then to make it so that the bubbles just show up where I've painted, I can click on the density factor here. I can pull out a wire, and I can stick it here into the extra socket. Now this is going to put this density factor right over here on the geometry nodes modifier. Now instead of using a single value, I want to choose the weight painting. So I'm going to click on this button here, the input attribute toggle. So this can use a value instead. So I'll click on the density factor and I'm going to choose the point group float. And this is the actual weight painting data. So now if I start to weight paint, you can see the bubbles are just showing up where we've weight painted. Now the bubbles are kind of disappearing and it's hard to actually see how they're going to look. So to get rid of this, I can scroll my mouse wheel right over here and you can see there's this overlays button and I'm just going to click on the overlays button to hide it. So now we can paint here, but we can't actually see the weight painting. So now I can just kind of paint along and I can make the bubbles where I want. Now I also want to have the bubbles be a random different size for each bubble. So to do this, I'll go to the add menu and I'm going to search for the random value node. Let's click on the random value and I'm going to put it here under the object info. Now the random value will randomly generate values between the minimum and the maximum. And so instead of using one single scale value, which is right here on the instance on points, we can put the random value into the scale. And this way, every single bubble is randomly going to be generated from 0 to 1. So now we can change the different random values. So for the minimum, I want all the bubbles to be at least a value of 0.3, and then for the maximum, they can be 1. So now as I paint here, you can see there's just randomly different sizes of bubbles. So I'm going to hold down the control key and kind of paint away some bubbles to kind of get rid of some here and there. And also if I go up here to the distribute points on faces, if I want the bubbles to be more dense, I can turn up this density max, and I'm going to turn this density max to a 500. So there are a lot more bubbles. So I want the bubbles to be kind of in little clumps. So I'm going to kind of hold down the control key and paint away here to kind of paint away some of the mesh. You can also change the radius and the strength of your brush. So I'm just going to paint away some areas here, because that's a bit too many bubbles. But then here on the edges, I want to paint lots of bubbles. So I'm going to paint lots more value right here on kind of the ends. So just something like that is pretty good. And I think maybe the bubbles are a little bit too big. So on the random value maximum, I could turn this down to maybe like a 0.8. That's a little bit better. And then you could also turn up the density max if you wanted to. And I might turn this up to like a 600, so there's a little bit more bubbles. So just something like that is pretty good. There might even be a little bit too many bubbles, so I might get rid of some of them. And it kind of looks like someone mixed around the half and half, or mixed in some creamer or some milk into the tea, and then the milk kind of foamed up a little bit. All right, so I'm going to click on this button here to show the overlays again, and I'm going to scroll right back here and we'll change this back to object mode, and I'll click back here to go to the layout. And I'll press Ctrl S to save. So we've now finished all the materials. So now we can actually duplicate the objects and create the composition. So I'm going to select the single bubble object and I'll bring it down on the Z-axis and just put it under the scene so I can't see it. And I'm now going to select the teapot and I'll hit G to grab, and then I'll hit Shift Z, and Shift Z will exclude the Z-axis so I can move it along the table, and I'll rotate it around on the Z-axis and just stick it right there, maybe bring it forward a little bit. All right, I can select the camera, maybe move the camera in a bit, and then I can select the tea liquid and the tea saucer and the teacup, and I'll hit G to grab, and then I'll hit Shift Z to exclude the Z-axis, bring it over here, maybe right there, and kind of rotate it over on the Z-axis. So something like that. Maybe even rotate this teapot back here and bring it forward a little bit. And I can select the camera by clicking in the corner, and I'll hit G to grab to move the camera around, and then I can hit G to grab and double tap the Z key to bring the camera in and out. Then I'll select the spoon and I'll press G to grab, Shift Z, bring it along the table, and then bring it down on the Z axis. And we're going to zoom into it, and we're just going to stick it right down here so it's kind of resting on the table. So bring it down just like about that. So it's just sitting on the table. Maybe even bring it back a little bit, and maybe bring the camera down a little bit. And I want some of the spoon to be out of the shadow. So maybe rotate it and bring it right there. And I can now select the tea liquid, the tea saucer, and the teacup. I'll press Shift D to duplicate and bring it over here. So again, press Shift Z to exclude the Z axis. We're going to stick it right here, and I can rotate it around on the Z axis, and I'm going to stick it right there. And then I can also select the cloth napkin, G to grab, Shift Z, and we're going to bring the cloth napkin back here, maybe rotate it over a little bit, just kind of stick one of the cloth napkins right back there. So it's kind of just in the background. And this cloth napkin, I'll hit G to grab, Shift Z, bring it over. We can also rotate this cloth napkin. And actually, I think I want to switch these two napkins because I like the look of the other one a bit better. So I want the other one to be closer to the camera. So I'll bring this cloth napkin over here and rotate it and scale it down just a little bit. I also want to duplicate the spoon a few times, so I'll duplicate the spoon and I can move the spoon over here and I can rotate the spoon. You can also double tap the R key to use the trackball rotation, and I'm going to stick one of the spoons here inside the tea, and I will select it one more time. So select this spoon, duplicate it, and we'll move it back. And this one, I want to stick it on the saucer. So move it back there. We can zoom into it just so I can see it better. Maybe rotate it, bring it back a bit. And I think I actually want to rotate the spoon over so it's over on the other side so that this part is more in the light. And then also if I select the bubbles back here or select the tea liquid, I want to rotate this around on the Z-axis to put the tea bubbles kind of behind it. And if you wanted to make these look different, then you could go into weight paint mode and just change the weight painting to make it look a bit more unique. So real quick, I'll just do that. So let's go from object mode to weight paint mode. I can hold down the control key and just kind of paint away some areas and then paint in a few areas just so that it doesn't look exactly the same. So the bubbles are placed in a few random different areas. It'll be pretty hard to see, but I'll just make it look a little bit more random. And we can go back to object mode, and that's pretty good. So let's now create the other object up here, which is going to be that window shadow. So I'll press Shift C to center the 3D cursor, and I'll go to the add menu and I'm going to add a plane. Let's bring the plane up here and scale it up, and I can rotate the plane on the Y-axis by 90 degrees. All right, and I can bring that down, kind of scale it up a bit more, and then I'll go into edit mode, and I'm going to go here to the edge select, and I'll just select this edge and I'll extrude the edge out because we want the entire table to be covered by that shadow. So bring that over there so that it's all in shadow, and maybe bring this over. All right, maybe bring the whole thing over just a little bit. So I now want to add some loop cuts to cut out the windows. So I'll press Control R to add a loop cut. We'll click and drag the loop cut over here. Control R to add another loop cut and drag the loop cut there. And then Control R to add another loop cut. Let's bring it right there. And just continue to add more loop cuts on the other side. So now we have those beams there. Then Control R to add another loop cut. We'll bring this up here and we'll add another one right down here. So this is where the window is going to be. Press Control R to add another loop cut, and I'm going to scroll my mouse wheel out until there are 3, and I'll left click and right click so they stay where they are. And then again, just press Control R, and we're going to add loop cuts next to all these other loop cuts. And then finally, we're just going to add 2 more loop cuts in the center. You can scroll your mouse wheel until there are 2 loop cuts. You can left click and right click so the loop cuts stay where they are. And then you can scale the loop cuts down on the Z-axis and make them really small like that. So I can now go to the face select, and I'm going to hold down the Shift key and select all of these larger faces. And these are the windows, and I'll hit X to delete, and we'll delete the faces. So if I go back to object mode, now if I move this object around, you can see we have this really cool window effect. And if you want to make them a bit thicker, you can kind of scale this up a little bit and just kind of change the size of it and just move this around. Maybe I'll bring it back a bit. And then you can also select the sunlight, and you can rotate the sunlight to change the angle of the light shining in from the window. And you can go into the camera view and make sure it looks good from the camera's view. So I might want to select this object and scale it down a bit, maybe bring it forward so it's a bit smaller, and maybe bring it up on the Z-axis and just stick it right there. I think I want maybe to scale the whole thing up a little bit more. All right, let's save this again by hitting Control S, and I'm now going to be adding the little bit of steam coming up from the tea. So to do this, I'll be using the Images as Planes add-on. If you don't have the add-on enabled, you can click on Edit, you can go to the preferences, and then over here on the add-ons tab, you can search for images, and you can turn on the import images as planes add-on. So it's built into Blender, so you can just check mark it to enable it. And then if you close the user preferences, you can press Shift A for the add menu. We'll go here to image, and you can choose images as planes. And the link will be in the video description to the smoke image that I'll be using on Pixabay, so it's a free image, and I downloaded the highest quality version on Pixabay, so I'll select that one, and I'm going to click on emission, so it is an emission material, and then I'll click on import images as planes. So I'm going to bring this up and I can scale it up. Now you can see it doesn't actually have an alpha transparency, but we can just tell it that wherever the black values are, that is going to be transparent. So let's click over here on the shading workspace, and I can make this smaller, and I'll drag this out bigger. So for this material, I'm going to open up the emission here, and I can unplug it from the color. And then the emission strength, I'm actually going to turn that to 0. And then I'm going to unplug the alpha from the alpha because this image doesn't actually have an alpha transparency. And I'm going to put the color into the alpha instead. So by using the color, it's going to use the light and dark values to actually make it alpha transparency. So now you can see it's mostly transparent, but you can see there's just a little bit of color there. Now for the base color, I'm just going to make this fully white. So turn that way up so that it is white there. And now there's just a little bit of steam. But then I want to make the steam very, very subtle. So I'll go to the add menu and I'm going to search for a hue saturation value. And we'll put the hue saturation value in between the two nodes. So this value is going to make it lighter or darker. And so this value will control how visible it is. So if you want to be very visible, you could turn this way up to like a value of 4. And now you can see the steam quite well. Or if you turn it way down, it'll be more subtle. So I'm going to turn the value to like a 0.4, so it is quite subtle. So if I go into the camera view, let me just zoom out here, you can just see there's a little bit of steam, but it is quite subtle. Now I do want to be able to change the shape of the steam. So I'll go into edit mode and you can press Control E and I'm going to click on subdivide and I'll continue to do that. So Control E subdivide, Control E subdivide, and just do that many times until it's very subdivided. And I can now go here to the vertex select and I'll just select some of the vertices. So I'll just select this one here and then I can press the O key, and if I scroll over here, the O key is going to turn on the proportional editing. So I can now just hit G to grab, and I can scroll my mouse wheel to make the proportional editing bigger, and I can change the shape of the smoke. Now it is a little bit hard to see the smoke, so this value here, I'm going to turn that way up to like a 10, so it's really easy to see the smoke, so it's really bright. So I'll now go into edit mode, and I can just select some of the vertices and move them around. Let's go into the camera view, see how it's looking in the camera view, and I can just kind of change the shape of the smoke so it kind of fits the scene a little bit better. So maybe bring this part out, something like that. All right, and then I can bring the smoke up and bring it in here in front of all the objects, so it looks like there's steam coming up from all the different objects here. So something like that is pretty good. I like how that is. So now on the value here, I find that a 0.4 looks pretty good, so that it's very, very subtle. Although I do think I want to scale the entire thing a little bit smaller so it's not quite as big, but something like that's pretty good. So I now want to add a depth of field. So what I'll do is go to the add menu and I'm going to go to empty and I can just add an empty sphere, and empty objects won't show up in the render because they don't have visible faces. So an empty object is a great object to add a focus object for the depth of field. So I'll scale the empty way down and I'm going to stick it right here, kind of in the center of the T, and then I'll go into the camera view. Let's click here in the corner just to select the camera. We can go to the camera settings and we can actually go back here to the layout just to see this in the layout. So if you click on the camera and then go to the camera settings, you can turn on the depth of field, and on the depth of field settings, you can click here to choose a focus object, and I'm going to select the icosphere and the smoke object is in the way. So let's navigate over here, click on the eyedropper right here and then choose the empty object. So now in the camera view, you can change the f-stop to change how much blurring you want. And you could have a really big blur if you want. That does look kind of cool, but I think the blur is a bit too strong. And I find that a value of maybe 0.8 or 1 works pretty good. So generally things are all in focus, but kind of in the background here, these faraway objects and the wood table is a bit more blurred. Now let's also turn on the bloom and make it brighter. So I'm going to click here to go to the render settings and let's open up the bloom. And we already turned on the bloom, and the bloom is going to make the lighter parts be glowing a bit. So what I want to do is turn up the intensity a bit so it's a bit stronger. So let's just turn it up to like a 1 so you can see how bright it is. And then we can turn down the radius to make it a bit smaller. So I'm going to go with a radius of about 4.5. And then the intensity, we can just turn this down to make it more subtle. But I like having a bit of a bloom so that kind of like here, the metal spoon is a bit glowing, and also kind of here the lighter parts of the teapot are glowing a bit. So I think I'll go with a 0.3 on the intensity and a radius of 4. And then one more thing that I'm going to do is just bring the window object a little bit more forward, because I kind of want this spoon here to be kind of glowing a little bit. I think that just looks a bit nicer. All right, so we are almost finished. I'm just going to press Control S to save this again, and then I will press F12 to render. And since this is Blender Eevee, it renders really quite fast. So now we can just do a little bit of compositing to make the final image look really nice. So I'll click here to go to the compositing layout. Let's click on use nodes to use the compositing nodes. And I just want to add a very subtle vignette. So I will go to the add menu and I'm going to search for a box mask. We're going to use the box mask to create a vignette. And a vignette is basically a subtle darkness around the edges of the image. Let's Control Shift and select the box mask to preview it. And I can click here to make the box mask bigger. And I'm going to drag the width out, and I'm going to drag the width out so that that white box there is pretty large. So something like that. So then what I can do is make the height value the same value. So you can hover your mouse over the value, press Ctrl C to copy, and then hover your mouse over this value and press Ctrl V to paste the value. And also you can press the V key to zoom the background out and Alt V to zoom the background in. So now we have a white box with a black background, but I want to blur it, and then that's what we'll be using for the vignette. So I'll go to the add menu and we're just going to search for the blur, and we'll drop the blur here after the box mask. And for this scene, I found that a 250 on both of these values works pretty well. So there's just a subtle darkness around the edges. Maybe even bring this in a little bit if it's a bit too small. So that's a bit better. And now I want to mix in the render layers with the blur. So to do this, I'm going to go to the add menu and I'm going to search for the alpha over node. And we'll put the alpha over node here between the render layers and the composite. And then this blur here, this is going to go into the factor. And so again, the factor is determining what parts are going to be the top image and what parts are going to be the bottom image. Let's also plug the image up to the viewer so we can see the final compositing. Now right now the vignette is happening the opposite way. So you can see the image around here, but then in the center it is white. So that's because we need to put the image into the bottom one. And then the top one, that is going to be the color on the outside. So we'll just make the image fully black. You can make it whatever color you want, but I think fully black is pretty good. And then if you want to do just a little bit of color correction, you can. So I'll go to the add menu and I'm going to search for the RGB curves, and we'll put this between the render layers and the alpha over. And the C here is going to be just the overall colors. So I can click here to add a dot and maybe pull this out just a little bit, and then click here to add another dot and pull this down a little bit, just so that there's kind of a subtle curve there. And you can see without it, everything looks a little bit more gray, but then with it, it makes everything a little bit more contrasty. So you could do that if you want to. Also, if you want to add a little bit more blue to the image, you can click here on the B for blue. And then if you drag a dot farther into this corner, there's going to be more blue. Or if you drag it back, there's going to be less blue. So I think I'll just add a tiny bit more blue. So you can just use that to do a subtle bit of color correction. So once you like how the image is, then you can press the F11 key. The F11 key will go to the render result, and to see the compositing, we want to click on the drop down and click on the viewer node. So there is the finished composited image. And then you can click on image and click on save as. I'll just save this as final render in my project files. I'll just save it as a PNG image, and I can save this image. So thank you so much for watching the tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned a lot and got a lot out of the videos. And these free videos on my YouTube channel are made possible thanks to my supporters. So if you'd like to join my supporters in helping out this channel, then a great way to do that is by checking out my Gumroad store and Patreon page, where you can get the finished tutorial files and artwork project files, procedural materials, geometry node modifier setups, and lots more Blender content on my Gumroad store and Patreon page. Now I did mention this at the beginning of the tutorial series, but if you like creating this type of Toon style artwork, then I highly recommend checking out the Magic Storybook course on CG Boost. And that course will teach you so much more about creating stylized artworks in Blender, and it uses a method of combining 3D and 2D and the grease pencil to create cool different stylized artwork. And I've reviewed the course myself, and I can highly recommend it. So if you're interested in learning more about the course, then you can check out my affiliate link in the description. And if you purchase the course through my affiliate link, then I will earn a small commission. So that's a great way to help support this channel. But that's going to be it for this video. So I hope you enjoyed this, and thank you for watching.